So hello and welcome. And I'm going to try with some minor distractions to offer you the framing of the program and the key questions that we've used in each of the case studies and the cross-cutting issues across the cases. So first of all, to start with some of the questions that we asked in the case studies. So how do social actors, how do people react to complex, violent, prone context? What forms of agency do we see in these settings? And as one of the forms of agency, how do they confirm or negate the legitimacy of the use of violence, of actors who use violence, state or non-state? And how do they do that subconsciously or consciously, intentionally or not? What hinders efforts to engage in ways of the conflict? What hinders efforts to overcome conflict or the agency to just survive, mainly survive in conflict settings? What role do external actors play in this? And when we get a very rich and detailed understanding of the different forms of agency that people express in these settings, how can international or external actors possibly link up with that? Should they link up with that? For us, it's very much a question of whether intervention is in all cases appropriate, and how can they best link up with forms of agency that we observe in these settings. Now, where we are based, where we're coming from, we work in the Power and Popular Politics Research Cluster at IDS. We're not only looking at issues or contexts of violence, we're not only looking at peace building. What we bring to the debates on violence and peace buildings are conceptual lenses and frameworks for analysing politics and power, and how different identities, especially around ethnicity, age and gender, can inform agency in response to violent settings. So in each of the case studies, we do very thorough analysis of local setup of not just the actors, but also ideas about power, ideas about violence. We see the discourses around violence as one of the forms of power as well. And we've used a range of bottom-up qualitative methodologies to look at the different types of violence and the different types of agency in response. So, concerning violence, we not just look at acts of violence and actors who perpetrate violence. We have included some forms of symbolic violence and structural violence into our analysis and in the case studies. And one of the themes that we will be talking about today is what we've called invisible power, or the culture of violence, or a culture of fear. So it's not an act that you can witness in the public domain. But if I give an example from the Zimbabwe research, there is a very strong sense about what people can say in public and what not. And we look specifically at youth, and youth are socialized by parents and friends about how you should behave in public, how to avoid violent reprisals by the state. So this is not an act of violence, but the idea that you're constantly on the surveillance and constantly have to watch out. It becomes a subconscious, and that influences how people behave in the public domain. And so it's these ideas about what is violence and how it might affect you that we've also labeled as a form of violence. And it is very much influencing people's behavior and strategies and what they talk about and how they behave in public. Now, the different kinds of violence that might look disconnected in the first place turn out to be connected. So there is, we show linkages between, for instance, gang violence and gender-based domestic violence, that they might not be at the heart of the conflict that we were studying, but they spin off. They're connected between. There are connections between them, and so so in South Sudan, the gender-based violence that is observed in household is maybe off the radar of some of the peace-building interventions, because they're focusing on the cattle raids, but the two are very much connected, and can you resolve the one without looking at the other, as one of the examples. Now, what we find is that there's very much an interplay between violence as a social environment and the agency of people affected by it. And one of the propositions that we want to discuss with you today is that people have agency to respond to violence and their social environment, and even if it's a word or what they say about it, or gestures or actions, they all confirm or disconfirm the situation of violence around them. So they legitimize the situation or they challenge it. Even if people are not out in the street to protest a violent actor, just the way they talk to neighbors, for example, or whether they attend certain meetings can be an act of legitimizing the situation around them or not. And in our work, we've shown a very diverse range of forms of agency that people display in response to violence. And we want to, in our discussions today, broaden a perspective on all the forms of agency that we notice in local situations. Not just where people openly try to resolve and discuss conflict situations, but all the small, subtle ways in which people express that they disagree or do not or agree with a violent situation, with violent actors, and that invisible power, a culture of violence, the ways in which people denounce or condone violence, and the actors that perpetrate it. And we want to highlight forms of social leadership, the mobilizing capacity of people to mobilize around challenging or confronting a violent situation, and the ways in which people just exist or coexist with violent actors, or maybe it's a very conscious strategy to withdraw from anything that might pose risk. And people who know are very aware about the situation and what causes it, but it's such it might be so riskful to openly confront it that people very consciously withdraw from it as a form of agency. And we focus on the many forms of resistance, and from so a broad spectrum. In the Egypt case, it was very clear that people condoned violence by youth on the streets against the Morsi regime, but we also want to focus on very small, subtle forms of resistance, like in northern Kenya, where some women who belong to different ethnic groups, who were not supposed to talk to each other, decide that they will talk to each other as a way to show that they disagree with some of the dynamics that were going on between these groups. So we're going to focus on everyday actions quite a lot, everyday forms of resistance, everyday actions that legitimize violent actors, legitimize violence or delegitimize it. And hopefully with giving a much broader spectrum of forms of agency that are expressing these situations, we will be able to link up with discussions about, so what does it mean with interventions, what are implications if we also include all these other forms of agency that people express in relation to the conflict and the actors around them. What can we learn from there to think about interventions that are designed here? Just a final note, many of our studies are focused on the very micro level and getting that bottom-up perspective on violence and agency. But at various points we show how the violence dynamics and agency at the micro level are connected to the macro level, and how people's perceptions of the state and dynamics at national level inform their thinking and agency at local level, and how they respond to violence locally and also to their neighbors, friends and family. And I think so I've named a few of the key concepts, and especially in the breakout sessions in the afternoon, we will have the time to pursue those further.
Thank you very much, Marioka. I'm going to say one more word about method. We have been working, we are obviously, those of us leading on the case studies are researchers at the Institute of Development Studies, which prides itself on being an applied research institute. And we've been working in general in the country cases with people who, to some degree, are activists engaging in violent conflict settings. So not with research institutes particularly, not with academics in those countries, but with people who, to a greater or lesser degree, are actually involved in organisations which are working on and in conflict situations to somehow address aspects of the context from a sort of citizenship perspective. So methodologically speaking, again, there's a range of some difference between the cases, but most of the cases, I would say possibly all of them with the exception of Egypt, are to some degree action research rather than sort of pure academic research. And they were carried out in a way that was very much kind of interlinked with a process of activism with some kind of transformative aspiration about some level or some aspect of the conflict or post-conflict or conflict-affected situation. So the findings as well are not expressed in terms of, theory-building findings. They're very much about how one can engage with and contribute to that sort of activist process by using particular analytical lenses and helping people to think through things differently, look at things differently. And when I say people, this is as much people at the micro level in those conflict situations as it is people in funding agencies who might be thinking about what are the best things to support, what are the best ways to accompany and to contribute to resolving conflict or engaging constructively with conflict settings. So that's another characteristic I think is important. You can read more in each of the individual country studies on country reports on the specifics of the methodology, but it's an important aspect that most of them were very much conducted in action research mode, working with co-researchers who are at least as much activists as they are academic researchers. So perhaps we've got time for, if there are any kind of burning clarificatory questions that you want to ask what some of this means or whatever, we could perhaps take those now. And otherwise I think we should probably move straight on to the country presentations. Okay, let's move on. There will be other chances if there are clarificatory questions that come up. So could I invite all of our presenters for the country presentations to come up? You might need to bring chairs in some cases. I think it's probably best if we all start off up here. We're going to do the presentations in the following order. Kenya first, then South Sudan, then Zimbabwe, then Colombia. So could I invite Tom and Pata to join us up here? And for the Kenya one, is that okay? Or is it only Tom presenting? Okay, fine. Tom, would you like to join us up here? And also, James and Chucho, you can join us up here for the Colombia when you get to it.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Tom Ondijo. I'm going to present the Kenya case study, and the title is Roots and Roots of Political Violence in Kenyan Civil and Political Society, a case of Masapi. That was the research team and the people who have presented the paper. So before I give the findings, I think I need to give some background information or some contextual information about Kenya. And I want to start by saying that political violence is a very common problem in Kenya. It has an historical background. It's been there for a very long time, and still it persists up to the present times. Traditionally, it was people, raiding for cattle. That was during the pre-colonial days. During the colonial days, there was the Mau Mau Rebellion, which is the most notable one, which led to the struggle for independence. But since independence in 1963, the country has experienced various types of violence, but they have largely been controlled. But starting from late 1980s, there were mass protests and demonstrations basically against the Kanu regime. And people were agitating for change, and adoption of democracy to avoid the abuse of human rights by the government. And what happened when the government realized that the people were demonstrating and coming too much, the politicians of the time decided to hire youths, and to use them to beat their political opponents, and of course to provide security to the political masters when they went to political meetings or wherever they went and they thought that they were not accepted. So the notable ones were the Kanu youth wingers, and those were the most notable ones. So of course, since that time, there have been several other militias formed by politicians and to protect them, but also to protect their political interests. So since the late 1980s, violence in Kenya has become a popular way of getting and keeping power, and it's used all the time, particularly around election time, but some violence takes place even during times of no election. In the 1990s, the government accepted, to adopt a multi-party kind of system, which was there, and in the run-up to the first multi-party elections, the instance of violence in Kenya increased so much, with youths hired by politicians. Of course, some of the politicians wanted the status quo to remain, but through the ballot. And what they did was to use the youths to achieve that end. And of course, it looked, violence was working for them. It was delivering the results they wanted. But then what happened is that the violence was kept in check. They could come and then they control it. But the worst moment for Kenya came in 2007, 2008, when the country experienced large-scale post-election violence. And since that post-election violence, there have been quite a number of new forms of violence or new dimensions of violence taking place in the country, some of them including crime, economic sabotage, mob violence, but all of them in one way or the other are linked to politics. So today, violence is actually one of the major challenges in Kenya. And the other problem that has started up in the recent past, the problem of terrorism, I think for many of you are aware of what has been happening in Kenya with terrorism, is another form of violence because it has its own effects. So the study that we did, basically, there were those broad objectives, but the main objective for this one was to use a political settlement approach to try, to understand the manifestations of how political violence, political settlement in Kenya is upheld by a variety of interlinked forms of normal violence, which are themselves linked to a variety of other dependencies in society. So to be able to achieve that objective, we did a case study in Marsabit. I'm sorry, I don't have the map of Marsabit, but it's located in the northern part of the country, about 200 kilometers south of the Kenya-Ethiopia border. Now, Marsabit is a county, and from 2010, when the new constitution was promulgated in Kenya. And the county has experienced quite a lot of violence. For a very long time, violence in Marsabit is not a new thing, and it has been basically ethnic and inter-ethnic, and basically it has evolved around issues of natural resources, particularly land, water, and pasture. Given that this is, much of it is an arid and semi-arid area, these resources are very critical for the existence or for the survival of the people. So they have been fighting for this, and most interpretations of violence in this part of the world is explained in terms of these resources. And this is where our study is different, because it goes to get the citizen perspectives, whether truly, this is the only form of violence, or whether all violence that takes place in Marsabit is related to the issue of natural resources and etc. So recently, as we noted, there have been quite a number of issues related with violence, and we are going to see. So one of the questions that we asked, I want to say that I don't want to go much into the method part of how we did the study. I just want to go specifically highlighting some of the key findings. I know the findings are more. I may not cover all of them in this presentation. The report is there, and I hope if you get time, you can read through. So I'm flipping through one or two things that, in my opinion, think are important. So they may not be important for some of you who read the report. You might pick out different things, but this is according to me. So you forgive me that. So we asked people actually what they understood in their own understanding, what violence was, to give us their own perspective of violence. And one of the things they said is that, from 2009, there have been several instances. According to the ones we were given, we counted about 28 of them, of innocent people being killed when they are going about their normal business. Some are coming from the market, and on their way home, they get killed by unknown people, and they are dumped by the roadside. Some are shot when they are going through their, routine business. Some are captured and tortured and found elsewhere. So that's one form of violence that the people told us exists in Marsabit. The other one was small wars, and I must warn here that we have used the word small wars, but they may not be small. This is a direct translation of what the people told us. In Kiswahili. So when I talk about, small wars, I'm talking in relation to the language the people used in the research setting. But they are not small, because one of the things they said when they were referring to the small wars is that actually groups of people go to people's farms. They destroy crops. So it's not small, but to them they consider it small, where people burn people's houses, destroy their property, they steal animals, or they kill or massacre people. And we had cases where people had attacked a school and they killed school children, about 22 of them, and there are several other instances that are covered there to demonstrate how these small wars took place. Then there was economic boycott, and to be able to explain economic boycott, you go a little bit in detail, is that, as I said earlier, in Kenya, we have a new constitution that was promulgated in 2010. And one of the things that the new constitution did was to devolve power from the center so as to improve on governance and to improve the respect of human rights. And of course, for people to participate in governance and on issues that affect their lives. So during the 2008-2007 elections, a group of people, tribes, the Rendire, the Gapra, and the Pulchi, who were minority in the previous political order, decided to come together and form a coalition to win the elections and to have their own elected as governor. And this, they disturbed the order because politics in Marsabit was dominated by the Boran, who are the majority in the county. So the Borans were really not happy that they lost in the elections, and they decided to foment, a lot of violence. But one of them was, there was a business conference that was organized by the governor to try and draw people to come and invest in the county. So during the, during the time of the conference, is that the people, the Borans came with their own people with placards and etc., with the intention to disrupt the meeting, and they demonstrated and marched off from the meeting. And of course, later there was a national representative. They went there and they caused a lot of havoc. So, and then what followed was they asked their own not to buy things from any of these other tribes whom they considered to be their opponents. It was considered a form of violence. There were issues of hate speech and incitement that were being done by leaders and politicians. Some of them were done on mobile phones, and that was another thing we were told. We were told that by the time we were there, the issue of, there was a lot of tension and suspicion. Actually, we left there feeling that it was a melting pot, a bigger form of violence was going to break out, like what was happening in the neighboring Moyale County. So, basically, all these forms of violence that were said were understood as means of political communication. And the people had this to say in terms of their reactions and agents. Some people were revenge, or they retaliated. Some of the revenge was voluntary, some of it was not voluntary, like the example I've given of boycott, where the people were told not to buy with, from others. Some were trying actually to sabotage business. Some people, they resisted, as the case that was given earlier. Some women were told not to communicate with others, but they were silently communicating. Some were selling charcoal, which they had not been told not to sell. So they did it, and therefore there was an element of communication in between. But at the same time, some of these people waited for the government to come, and do something and respond. And of course, one of the things they said that was the government took too long to respond, or if it responded, the response was rather inadequate, And at one point, the people agitated that they had arrested a person who had killed another person, and he was released. They went and stormed the the county commissioner's office, and it was a very big form of violence there. So the other thing is that then what emerges is that there are other players in this violence, is that we might say that the police, by not acting, they are also taking sides. So they could be culprits, the government, and we have the political elites who belong to political parties, Jubilee and ODM, and so then what hinders action and facilitates violence is there are perceptions that violence is a local problem, and it doesn't really require national interventions, that people can deal with it at the local level. And that was probably informed that the government was not really keen to act. And if they were to act, they sent people from Nairobi who flew in for an hour a day. They said they have had peace meetings, and they have made declarations, and they go back to Nairobi and write a report, and that is it. But those peace declarations, they were not really working. So there was an issue of political patronage where the Jubilee government, which was allied to the Porans, were not really keen to take an action against the Porans because they were allies. So political patronage, some people were doing things that arrested local and nothing happens. The other issue was the social media, is that there was a business of people, particularly the youth, sending messages on phones to each other. Some of the messages were meant to incite, and were perpetuating hate speech. So they in a way hindered peace initiatives. And there are other means, like the porter, people have motorcycles that enable them now to move a lot much faster to where there are problems, particularly the youth, to go and cause violence. The other issue we found is that we have grand elders who have lost much of their power, and some of them were being used by the political elite. While some of them were genuinely trying to work towards achieving peace, others were really being used by politicians, particularly the Porans. We were told they were using teachers, a few other people to collect money from each and every member of their community so that they can use it to make it very difficult for the governor to govern the county, and therefore then the national government will cancel the county and return it to the national government. We also realized that, found out that religion, particularly the Christians and Muslims, were pulling towards different directions and making it really very difficult to come into any form of business, peace. what was the role of NGOs, donors, and other external? Yeah, just a minute. I'm almost finishing. Yeah, so there were quite. There was not really much NGO engagement. What there were NGOs that were being funded by USAID and the European Union, and what they did was just to go around and educate people on the negative sides, create awareness and tell people the negative effects. But many people said they didn't really feel, the impact of the NGOs. Of course, there are also local NGOs. They didn't feel, but there are some women groups, community-based, which one or two of them were identified as, cutting across, all the tribal barriers to try and bridge peace. And their level of success we could not ascertain, but they were trying to do some good work. So the impact of really the NGOs was not visible, and perhaps the advice was not very useful and effective in any meaningful way in generating peace. And so the NGOs sometimes are under pressure from the government, and therefore they don't want to be seen to be antagonistic with the government, and therefore it really makes it very difficult for them to render their services. In conclusion, I will say is that the complexity of community groups, which are divided along different religious, ethnic affiliation, gender, social status, age, and all that, they constrain citizen action and peace initiatives in Marsabit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I should have said at the beginning that I would be waving pieces of paper at people. Sorry. So we'll move on to South Sudan for a brief presentation by Mariota there. The Zimbabwe colleagues, would you like to come up because you're next up?
I was assuming many of you are fairly knowledgeable about the many conflicts that we have in the world, so I'm not including a long historical overview of the situation in South Sudan, but I'll jump straight to the case study that we did. Unfortunately, my colleagues from the research team can't be here because of visa issues. It's currently very difficult to get visa. You have to go to Nairobi in order to get a visa to the UK. So I'll do my best to give the perspectives, also represent their perspectives as an outsider. We looked specifically at gender identity and how the violence is experienced differently by men and women, and how agency in response to the violence and insecurity is different because of gender dynamics. And I also have to say that we did this field research before the most recent turbulence in South Sudan, when things were starting to fall apart again, and fortunately in the northern parts of the country. Where were we? We were in Eastern Equatoria State, which is the southeast of the country on the Ugandan border. So many of the, and we looked at internal conflicts within the country, so between different ethnic groups, or within this, among ethnic the groups from the same group, but among clans and villages, and not the north-south conflicts that are still going on at the border with Sudan. So we were, and that matters because we were with the Latuko, which are a minority in South Sudan, and much of the attention has gone out to Nuer and Dinka and national level political settlement. But we were with different people. But that dynamic of Nuer and Dinka dominating at the top does matter for how these people feel insecurity and how they respond to it. And I'll come to that in a moment. So this is a group of which many are agriculturalists, and some have large stock of cattle. So there's different types of violence related to that. And I also find it important to highlight that people live with the state institutions, local state administration, which is still very remotely present in people's lives. Of course, the government has done a great deal of trying to get local government working, reaching out into the vast areas of South Sudan, but for many people it's still a very long way before they encounter the first government official. In this particular group, governance is very much regulated by customary institutions. The Monyomiji, which are age groups of the adult men. So they decide on many issues in the community. Originally, a lot to do with cultivation, but because of the situation in the country, the groups or the group of men talk a lot about the public affairs, what they hear on the radio maybe from other parts of the country, and how that affects local security. And they discuss the strategies of how they're going to respond, either to very local conflicts in the next village, but also to what they've heard about other parts of the country. This will be discussed in the evening. So they come together in councils several times a week in the evening to discuss any news and affairs and possibly responses to it. But it's not just a practical governance institutions of how the village is run and things are organized. It is a very important site where young men are socialized into the norms of community and what it means to be a man, what a masculine identity is. And in the current situation, that masculine identity is very much about protection of the village and the women and the people and the land. So that's a very important place where they get their social education and learn to be like good, responsible men. Now, during the war, this institution of the Monyomiji and this council of adult men was disrupted because this Eastern Equatoria was a place where the SPLA had its, so the insurgent army had its base, and many of the people were recruited into that, whether they wanted to or not. And it was on the front line of the Sudanese army and between the Sudanese army and the SPLA. So people could have been drawn into the different armies. So this local arrangement of the Council of Men was disrupted for a long time, and now after the war people feel that's really important for their identity to put it back in place again. It's also practical for designing security strategies, but also it's giving them back something they have lost during the war. We used participatory photography as part of the research method, so I'm going to discuss some of the findings by pictures. So there was a range of different types of violence that people here experienced. Some of it was cattle and related. Different ethnic groups juxtaposed, but the people are very aware that sometimes at higher level politicians are playing identities against one another. Especially the women were talking about enemies in the bush, and this signifies how people feel insecurity locally. There might be an enemy militias at any moment of the day. Even if it hasn't happened in a year or so, people are afraid that this might any day come to their village. Like the cattle raids, and it's something that might happen any time. So the volatility is very much what shapes people's sense of security. And there were a couple of land and border conflicts with neighboring counties and villages that were simmering at the time of the research. So of the causes of violence, of course, there's a lot of small arms and the legacy of the Civil War that people highlighted as causes of the violence, and people will point at the politicized conflicts of politicians involved in instigating violence in the arms, illegal trade of arms across the border. But one of the effects of the war was it produced like this male identity in the customary institutions, that people feel, the men feel they have to re-establish their authority in the village in that customary setting of the Monyomiji. And that has generated its own dynamic of violence, which links private domestic violence to violence caused by like outsiders, cattle raids, or the state. And that's what I wanted to focus on in a minute. So, the perceptions of the state and how the political settlement is at the moment shapes very much how people experience insecurity locally. So when we asked, what does the state do for you in response to your insecurity, this is the picture that we got back. Like, there is a hope in the new South Sudan, but there's also a strong sense that it's not working for people, especially for this minority in this part of the country. And for them it's evidence that other militia, like the Yao Yao militia in Jonglei state, a different state, it's so very far away and very unlikely that it would ever come their way, but to them it's evidence that the state is not able to protect and might any time come in their lives. That's why the title of the report is may approach as rapidly as bushfire, and that's everyday people's everyday sense of security and insecurity. And as I mentioned, politicians and government being the cause of violence itself in many people's experience. So that unequal distribution of power, and that they're not part of that political settlement, makes people insecure, and therefore it motivates people to come up with their own strategies and their own agency, because they have to take care of themselves. And the customary institutions is the response to that. That is now is promoted, is stimulated to do even more of the security response than it has done originally in the past. So people feel they need to stay together and sort out their own security. So this is the meeting place where the Council of Elder Men, the Munyomiji, where they meet. The place itself is called the Amangat. They call it village parliament, but it's men only, so it's not exactly parliament as we would think of it. And it's like this is the physical meeting place where women are not allowed to enter at any time. So what the men do is develop security strategies, and some of them are like that women should not travel to certain areas, or they should not leave the house after a certain hour of the day or be back at a certain hour. Now this is complicating the lives of women because they have to go to markets or sell their produce or buy produce or connect with relatives through marriage in a different place. They're not always able to complete their household chores, which, if that doesn't happen, has led to domestic violence in the household. So although the strategy is about insecurity elsewhere, outside, it's very closely linked to how women experience insecurity inside the household. Because they're not part of this village council, it's very difficult for them to have any influence in how these security strategies develop. But because of living in such an insecure state, women themselves also legitimize this customary institution, even if they have negative side effects on the other end. But some women are able to access. The women have their own express own forms of agency to try influence the security arrangement. So there may some of the older women, or some that have inherited a traditional leadership function, might stand out of this circle outside and try to whisper or try to attract the attention of men in that circle, to try influence and voice the opinion of the women about security arrangements, and try to improve it for themselves. But on the other hand, if there is a land conflict simmering at the border, women will tell their men, like, why are you not behaving like men? If those men from the other side of the border get us, we will bear the children of that other group. So they play with this masculine identity of their own men, to say, like, you might need to go and fight, even if that has negative repercussions for them as women. So they legitimize the use of violence and the use of those local security strategies, while they're also, on the other hand, have to try to negate the negative effects it has on them. Now, linking this to the discussion of today about interventions, what you would see the South Sudanese NGO civil society do is to separate domestic violence from the other conflicts. So how to resolve domestic violence was by gender desks in police stations, try to work on the limited use of alcohol, work with formal state institutions of the police, but these are very remotely present in women's life and not always trusted. And the power of customary institutions was discredited as backwards and traditional and to be left behind. But actually the only way that women themselves, where they see that agency and change is possible, was by working with those customary institutions as well. That's where they conferred legitimacy in. So there were all kinds of discrepancies between interventions from the outside that legitimized state institutions which didn't figure in the lives of women, and which they rather not have intervene. Not making this link between the effects of the conflict by cattle raids and land conflicts and the domestic level. So it's as if they were not. So it was as if they were not connected. But in the lives of women, there wasn't that much of a. They were flowing into each other. And I would like to continue a discussion about those linkages and the discrepancies between legitimacy in the right session in the afternoon. Yep, that was the South Sudan case.
Thank you. I didn't even have to show my time up card. Perfect timing. Thank you. So let's move on swiftly to another point in Africa, to Zimbabwe. Lloyd, would you like to take the floor, and I'll show you when you have 5 minutes.
Good morning. Just before we started, my name is Lloyd. Just before we started the discussions, I was just chatting to Jethro, and he says to me, this event is being streamed live. So I think all of you will say, oh, that's beautiful. But what came to my mind was, what? That's like endangering me. So this is the kind of thing that I have in Africa, where I come from, Zimbabwe, where everything that I do is conscious of my security. So yeah, whilst technology is beautiful, it's also a danger, especially if you live or stay in some kind of regime. So that's just one point to note. So my kind of thinking also is a reflection of the kind of youth that we were studying in Zimbabwe. So our study was specifically looking at youth and how they respond to the kind of regime that we have. So, firstly, also when Tom was doing a country profile for Kenya, for a moment I thought, well, probably he's profiling the wrong country. He's profiling Zimbabwe. So the dynamics are more or less the same. The aspect of the youth being involved in politics, being used as political weapons to advance political agendas. So I think the country background between Kenya and Zimbabwe are more or less similar. Yes, we have the youth being assets, but also as also resources for use in politics. If I do a country profile or like the history, you probably think I'm duplicating what Kenya is. We attained our independence in 1980, but I think by and large, the culture of violence has always been a part of our political culture. Zimbabwe was colonized in 1890 by the British, of course. But in between that time, through the attainment of independence, I think that element of violence has always been inculcated in our relations, whether it be black versus white or black versus black, tribe versus tribe. So that element of violence has always been there. Violence is a means to an end, to settle disputes. So you use violence, you use force, you assert yourself by violent means. So this is the kind of culture that we find the youth living in. And at independence, soon after independence, we had the government, the ZANU-PF government, then trying to assert itself and then perpetrating violence, which is commonly referred to as Gukuraundi in Zimbabwe, where it is estimated that maybe about 20,000 people were killed during that time. Then violence also escalating during the electoral periods. So violence is related or is linked to or at least the amount of violence is linked to the electoral cycle. As this happens even in modern society. So I think what is important, just to discuss the findings, is that we were looking specifically at youth between 18 and 25. So that age gap is important in trying to understand how youth of different ages relate or respond to violent situations. For instance, if you look at somebody who is between 18 and 20, 16 and 18, they have no experience in violence, direct experience in violence, compared to somebody who is between 18 and 22, who has had some experience with political violence, in the sense that they are politically conscious, and these are the kind of youth that the political systems will use, whether opposition political parties or the ruling party or any other person aspiring for political office. You probably rally around the youth between 18 and 22. Then those who are between 18 and 25, they'll probably think about starting a family, and their response is a little bit different from the ones that are very active between 18 and 22. As in some cases, we have youth marrying a little bit earlier compared to what happens in Europe. So maybe at 20, at 21, somebody can start a family. At 25, you can start a family as a young man, so which is different from here. So I think that age group affects how people relate to the violence. So I'm just jumping back and forth so that I capture the important. Sorry, I'm rushing to the conclusions. Yeah. Okay. Right, so the key finding is that we found out that youth are they say they are politically excluded in participating. They have played a key political role in delivering systems in regimes. They've been used in incidents like the fast land reform. They've been key drivers to that. Yes, we've got the elders there, but the youth are the ones that go about do the actual action. They've got the energy to drive the forces. At independence, you'd find youth rallying people to attend mass rallies, and even when you're running up to political to elections, the youth go about mobilizing people to attend political meetings. They go about doing everything that is very important. But in terms of space or getting positions in government and benefiting, there's absolutely nothing for them. So they are politically excluded in making decisions in that respect. Whether be it government, they are not positions that are assigned for youth, but they play a key political role when the actual processes happen. And there is also an aspect of economic exclusion which takes place. Yes, they've been key drivers to delivering regimes, but in 2000, the government embarked on the first land reform where they took land from the white farmers, which is what is probably known in the history of Zimbabwe, that the government took farms from the whites. The youth were the actual people who went out and grabbed those farms, but very few of them were allocated farms, and they did not benefit from the process, but they were very active. So there have many government officials possessing 5-10 farms with farm implements, government projects coming up, youth funds assigned for youth to back on projects, but that money is rooted by senior officials, and the very few youth who benefit from those funds are probably the sons and daughters of those chefs. So there's very little that is left for the ordinary youth who is not politically connected. Then the aspect of social exclusion in society. So in the African societies, in most cases, you respect your adults. So your thinking is framed around respecting your adults. What the adults say, you cannot go against. So basically, if you start to question your adults or your elders, if you start to question your elders, then you are a misfit in society. So that's the kind of structure. Those structures are persistent, and even at political even political parties are structured around the chain of command, which is basically how we relate in a society. So the elders are there. You sit. What you do is listen to the elders, and what they say is law. When you basically carry out whatever they say. If you question, then you're about to face some repercussions to that. Then one of the most important things one of the key things that we found out from the youth is that when they start to assert their space, to assert what is important for them, then the elders in society, whether be political in society, they are defined as born-frees. Born-frees are basically those people who are born after independence, 1980. And you start asking for those benefits. Just somebody just wakes up and says, so who are you? We're not there when we fought for this country, we bought this country. And there's a joke that happens in Zimbabwe around youth about that aspect of being born-frees, which is the title of our report. Is that the youth are saying, okay, if you think that we didn't fight the liberation struggle, then why don't you take the country back to the colonial guys, to the colonial masters, and we're going to free the country again, so that we also benefit from the processes. So I think that kind of thinking is, for me, is very important. Just being free, you are excluded because you're a young man or you're a young woman. So for the youth, that was very important. So the assumption is that the youth are basically violent. There are tools that can be used to deliver regimes. There are tools that can be used by government, by opposition parties to advance their ends. But what's it in for them? Nothing specifically. So, but we should not be fooled that youth are just tools. I think that those youth that participate for benefits that they can always get. There are those who try to think that if they participate, they can get some few benefits. Yeah, people are doing that. There are many who do that a lot. So they're not always tools because they're unemployed. They participate in violence, yes, because they're unemployed largely, yes. But there are those who participate because there are benefits that can be accrued out of that participation. So the targeting really is mainly around elections. Yes, it's every day. Yes, political chefs can come and do A, B, C, D. But that kind of participation is mainly around elections, where you'd find the youth are used to go out and beat political opposition. So how do youth exercise agency in that kind of scenario? So the things that we discovered was that, we came up with the strategy of avoidance. In some cases, they do avoid politics. They do avoid politics, but how feasible is it to avoid politics totally in a politically charged environment? Almost impossible. Like I was saying, the aspect of infiltration within the system. The government has its people in and around everywhere. So you'd hear somebody say, we discuss politics when it's only safe, and you only do that when it's only safe. There is a statement that we say sometimes wars have ears. So you have to be very conscious where you discuss politics, who we talk politics with. So that kind of exclusion, that kind of thinking also frames our existence, our day-to-day life. Then you also sometimes have to coexist with the perpetrators. Yes, I think one of the most bizarre of examples that we came across was some young girls having to date a perpetrator so that they could protect their families. So that way, it's a hard choice, but these are hard choices that the young ladies are facing to try to protect their families. So it's very difficult for them. Then sometimes they have to create alternative spaces. This we found mainly in the southern part of the country, which is mainly in the Ndebele side, that uses art to express how they live. It doesn't happen on the northern part of Zimbabwe, which is where the larger population lives. which is the shorter part. So that, I mean, creating alternative spaces, it does happen, but not to the extent that you'd want to say we can replicate it across the country. Then to a lesser extent, people use defiance. Like I was saying, when the elders speak, you just listen to them. So in some cases, you just listen and walk away, or do other chores that you can possibly do when meetings are being called out. But that, it doesn't really happen in the rural settings because you'll be targeted. Then activism. This we found in the urban location. We were doing research in, where it's a strong word for the opposition political party. So it's easier for the youth there to actively defy the system. There are political clashes within that neighborhood because it's urban and the constituency is mainly opposition controlled. So I talked about during elections, youth are coerced to participate in politics, but they also take opportunities to also gain some freebies there. Then the cross-cutting issues that we came across is that there are many tactics that youth can use just to find a way around, whether be it to coexist, to defy, but the dynamics range whether you're a young woman or you're a young man. So it depends on what choices you have. For the women, it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult for the young girls to find space and create alternative space in between. Then the way we are structured in our society is we are structured in such a way that your families can limit how your kind of thinking. Your family, your friends, they teach you how to think. You don't discuss this particular subject in spaces. So your parent can tell you that your engagement in politics can endanger us. So when you go to university, don't engage in politics. Don't do this, it endangers us. So your kind of thinking is framed around your family values, your African values. You're an African, so you must behave like an African. So that is for your security. So this is the kind of people that we have who are structured in such a way that you have to fit into and conform to society. And the aspect of generational gap that exists impedes the kind of agency. So you relate as an adult, you relate to an elder, and you have to give that respect to these people. So legitimacy, you also give legitimacy to people who are older than you, even if sometimes you don't agree with what they say, what they stand for. So these are some of the things that we came across, and we'll be open for discussions once you read our report. And just if you want to discuss issues in detail about our findings, then we can always discuss that during the free time. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're coming to the last of our marathon of rapid country presentations. We're going to present from Colombia now, and Chucho is going to start with the help of James interpreting, and I'm going to present the last couple of slides on Colombia. I'm just going to check that the clicker works. So, over to you, Chucho and James. This presentation will take slightly longer because of the interpreting. Okay.
Buenos días. El caso que hemos estudiado en Colombia está referido a la costa pacífica en un lugar que se llama Buenaventura, el principal puerto del país en este momento.
Okay. Hello, the case that we're going to look at for Colombia is on the Pacific coast of Colombia in a port called Buenaventura, which is currently the largest port in the country.
Para empezar, quisiera hacer un breve contexto de lo que está ocurriendo en el país para entender muy brevemente la situación de conflicto que allí se presenta.
I'm going to start with a very brief context of the country, provide a brief contextualization of the country so that you can understand the conflict, which provides the context for the situation that we've analyzed.
Colombia es un país que tiene una condición bastante contradictoria en la medida en que su economía ha ido creciendo de manera acelerada, pero al mismo tiempo conserva unas inequidades sociales muy altas en continuos momentos repetitivos, tal vez la más alta de la región de Latinoamérica o en un segundo lugar. El conflicto que allí se presenta es de larga duración, iniciado para muchos autores desde el año 1946 en una primera etapa de confrontación entre partidos políticos liberal y conservador, y luego una segunda etapa larga iniciada en el año 1964 entre la insurgencia guerrillera que tiene por vocación la toma del poder y el Estado colombiano. Desde el año 64 hasta el año 74 surgieron 6 grupos guerrilleros en Colombia, y posteriormente surgen los grupos paramilitares orientados y formados por las fuerzas oficiales, que condujeron al país a una violencia desaforada con un resultado lamentable de alta degradación del conflicto en los derechos humanos. Unos datos básicos: podríamos decir que el centro del conflicto nace por un problema de tierra, acaparamiento de tierras, concentración de la propiedad, y que luego se va extendiendo a otras áreas del país y que coge una dimensión urbana. Posteriormente aparece el narcotráfico en los años 80 como un factor que incrementó este conflicto. Para citar algunas cifras básicas, y con esta parte concluimos, hoy en día el Estado mismo reconoce que hay 7.200.000 personas víctimas de esta violencia, de las cuales 6 millones son desplazados internos.
Okay. So Colombia is a contradictory country because it's actually had a very strong economic performance, high levels of growth, but it's also got extremely high levels of inequality. It fluctuates, but it fluctuates between being the most unequal and perhaps the second most unequal country in Latin America. And it's been characterized by a very long-standing conflict. Most authors, or many authors, put the current conflict to having started in about 1946 in conflict that occurred between the two principal political parties, the Liberal and the Conservative parties. And then a second phase that started more or less in 1964, which is characterized as a conflict between the guerrilla groups and the states, guerrilla groups interested in actually seizing power. And between 1964 and 1974, 6 guerrilla groups were founded. And after them, in the 1980s, fundamentally, right-wing paramilitary groups supported by and working hand-in-hand with the state security forces increased the levels of violence dramatically, leading to a very terrible degradation of the conflict and very serious human rights abuses. The conflict fundamentally started as a struggle for land, a process of land concentration of ownership, and the consequent struggle of the guerrilla groups against that. Then in the 1980s, fundamentally, drugs trafficking entered the scenario to complicate the situation. Just very, very briefly, some kind of figures as I come to the end of this brief context. The Colombian state itself recognizes that there have been some 7.2 million victims of this conflict, this long-running conflict, of whom 6 million are internally displaced.
La primera pregunta de nuestro trabajo de investigación se sitúa en cómo reacciona la gente en el contexto violento y cómo en ese contexto ejerce la violencia. Para el caso que nos ocupa de Colombia, de varios de los hallazgos que pudimos encontrar, hemos seleccionado como la reacción principal el factor de resistencia, o la resistencia como la principal acción de reacción frente a este conflicto. Pero esta resistencia la hemos categorizado como en 2 dimensiones. Una primera expresión de esa resistencia se refiere a la creación de espacios de protección frente a la violencia y a las acciones de protesta o frente a esas mismas acciones violentas. Y una segunda dimensión de la resistencia como construcción de alternativas. En la primera dimensión de la resistencia en cuanto a espacios de protección y de protesta, podríamos señalar varios ejemplos. Uno de ellos son las denuncias directas, abiertas, denuncias de carácter judicial, pero también denuncias de carácter social, amplio, que tienen como fundamento o como finalidad la construcción de una memoria social sobre el conflicto. Una segunda expresión de esa resistencia son las movilizaciones, las diferentes expresiones de acción social de protesta. Una tercera manifestación estaría más en el ámbito de lo privado, es ese silencio que desarrolla la comunidad, la sociedad de manera consciente para poder navegar, para poder convivir en medio de este conflicto. Una cuarta también corresponde a cómo la comunidad se organiza ella misma para resolver todos aquellos vacíos de la acción social del Estado y cómo a través de sus propias formas organizativas se han creado espacios de salud, de educación, frente a esos vacíos que genera la acción pública. Y finalmente, en este campo de la resistencia como espacio de protección, emergen los enfoques estratégicos en cuanto a cómo se selecciona la relación con el Estado. Un Estado que es ineficiente, en general catalogado por la comunidad, pero a pesar de ello, cómo se aprovecha de él algunos espacios para reivindicar acciones sociales positivas, también ya sea en el campo económico o en el campo político.
Okay. So the first research question that we looked at was the question of how do people react to the violent context they live within and how do they exercise agency. And the findings, we had sort of two broad categories of finding. The first one was that they acted through the exercise of resistance, and the second broad category of findings was through the creation of alternatives to the situation. So the first one, in terms of resistance, divided into five aspects. The first is denunciation, public complaint, public denunciation of what's happening, both at the legal level, but also at a broad societal level, in order to try and construct a social memory of the conflict, of what has happened, so that people are conscious and aware of what is taking place. And the second is mobilization, demonstrations, mass mobilization of the population. The third is a kind of a private strategy, a conscious use of silence, of not necessarily speaking out about things, so that people are able to navigate the complicated environment that they have to live in. The fourth aspect is community organisation, to organise community responses in order to compensate for the absence of state action. So community approaches to health, community approaches to education, etc. And the fifth, the final of these strategies, is despite the presence of an inefficient state and a state that people don't trust, is a strategic use of the state, taking advantage of it in order to be able to generate positive action, for instance, in economic areas or in political areas, because it is a state after all, and so there are ways it can be used also.
En la segunda expresión de esas formas de construcción de resistencia en cuanto a alternativas de carácter más social, pero también alternativas frente a la acción misma del conflicto, podríamos señalar que ante un conflicto tan prolongado, tan degradado como ha estado ocurriendo en Colombia, han surgido diversas formas de resistencia como alternativas a la violencia. Ejemplos de ellos como comunidades de paz, como espacios humanitarios, o como otras expresiones que tienen que ver más en la fuerza de la acción civil frente a la acción armada. Pero igualmente alternativas ya no solamente a la violencia directa, sino a aquello que hemos catalogado en el estudio como la violencia estructural generada por el modelo de desarrollo. Entonces surge la resistencia como alternativas no solamente de desarrollo, sino al modelo de desarrollo. Por lo tanto, se generan propuestas como aquellas que están surgiendo, como el buen vivir, que es un concepto que nace de la tradición de los pueblos andinos, o del plan de vida como surge en los movimientos indígenas colombianos, o toda la reclamación que se está haciendo en la actualidad por la protección de los bienes comunes para la humanidad, como son el agua, como son en definitiva aquellos elementos fundamentales para la existencia. Pero otro ámbito de las alternativas radican también en las formas como podemos comunicar, en las formas como frente a un lenguaje que los medios masivos de información, que la prensa en general y que el conflicto ha generado como unas formas naturales de absorber la expresión en la relación más como un lenguaje de dominación, como un lenguaje violento per se, es como se han generado diversas formas de contrarrestar ese lenguaje que naturaliza la violencia a través de expresiones artísticas, expresiones más de índole cultural, para generar unas expresiones o un lenguaje más de la construcción de estrategias de paz.
And then in the area of resistance to the creation of alternatives to the social conflict and attempts to counteract the violence caused by the results of such a long conflict. Then there have been different responses to the phenomenon of physical violence, of hard violence, if you like, such as the creation of peace communities, or peace communities that reject the presence of any armed actors, or the creation of humanitarian spaces that have a similar reason to them, or other civil actions that are established in order to confront armed violence. So there have been initiatives like that. But there's also, in the study we've looked at principally at two different kinds of violence: the violent, direct act violence, but also structural violence, and perhaps more invisible violence that's associated with the model of development. And so there have been proposals which have come from communities to try and counteract the overarching model of development, such as good living, the Buen Vivir, which is associated with the Andean peoples, with the peasant peoples, or life plans, Planes de Vida, which are associated very much with the indigenous communities in Colombia. But there's also been a movement to protect common goods, such as public goods, such as agua, which are water, which are needed in order to for people, the sustenance of life, that are needed in order for people to be able to resist. Also an emphasis on forms of communication. The mass media in Colombia are very functional to power. They reproduce a language of dominance, and they reproduce forms of violence. And so there's been a movement of alternative communication as well, fundamentally based in cultural activity and art, in order to instill an alternative public discourse.
La acción social, o la acción de la ciudadanía frente a este marco de conflicto y violencia, es una suerte de espacio de navegación, o lo que nosotros también en el lenguaje más local podríamos denominar como de anfibios sociales, poder caminar en diferentes escenarios. Unos ejemplos de esa manifestación de la acción social, en el caso de Buenaventura, se quiere resaltar una de las acciones que fue la marcha realizada el 19 de febrero de 2014. ¿Por qué quisimos resaltar este hallazgo o este dato? Porque la violencia llegó a tener unas expresiones extralimitadas en el caso de Buenaventura. Por ejemplo, la creación de lo que en el lenguaje local llamamos casas de pique, es decir, lugares de desmembramiento de los cuerpos en centros de residencia normal de las comunidades más populares, más locales, que llevó a un nivel de alta complejidad, que finalmente la comunidad se organiza y todos los sectores sociales de la ciudad para hacer una protesta. Es decir, el terror que se había creado con la violencia venció todo límite, la resistencia o el soportarlo, para llegar a manifestarlo en esta marcha, una marcha que llegó a movilizar a miles de personas. Se calcula entre 20.000, otros hablan de 30.000 los que estuvieron allí en esta manifestación. Este año, por ejemplo, se conmemoró el primer año de la marcha y en vista de que no ha mejorado la situación, la gente nuevamente fue a protestar, fue a la alcaldía a tener unas acciones simbólicas, porque una de las reclamaciones principales de esta marcha, por ejemplo, fue el derecho al agua, el agua potable en la ciudad, y como no había ocurrido todavía esa transformación, un ejemplo simbólico de la acción o acción simbólica frente a eso fue irse a bañar delante del alcalde con agua en vasijas para significar que todavía se está esperando esa reclamación. Pero otra forma y otro ejemplo de ello es cómo esa conducta social requiere de una fina relación o articulación de redes para crear alianzas seguras, porque en medio del conflicto, en medio de la violencia, lo que más ha crecido es la desconfianza y por lo tanto se debe generar un tejido social que permita identificar con quiénes se puede y con quiénes no se puede hacer alianza para establecer este tipo de acciones. Entonces, recuperar la confianza va a ser una larga tarea en un proceso de posconflicto, pero mientras tanto hay que afinar ese tipo de relaciones para estar seguros en las acciones de esa agencia ciudadana.
Okay, so citizen action, another kind of what we call, citizens are involved in the navigation of public space, so what we call in local terms in Colombia, you need to be a social amphibian so that you can operate in different environments on the water and on the land. So an example of that in Buenaventura has been the mass march of the 19th of February 2014, which was organised in response to the dreadful levels of violence that had come to characterise the city, of which the most notorious example of what are called the casas de pique, or the generally translated as the chop houses in Buenaventura, which were houses that were set up in residential areas with the purpose of taking victims and chopping them up, with all of the sounds and implications that meant for the population. Now, this situation of such horror led to an overflowing really of resistance, and so thousands of people, 1,000, maybe 20 or 30,000 people took part in a march to protest against this terrible situation. But it was also a protest about the lack of social provision. So this year, on the anniversary of the march, which had also demanded and had been promised as a result of the march, and the provision of drinking water, of proper water, a promise which wasn't fulfilled. And so the demonstrators this year went and stood outside the town hall, outside the mayor's office, and symbolically washed themselves using glasses of water as a demonstration of the fact that water wasn't available. Another technique that is used is the construction of networks, but the construction of safe networks. In a situation like this, where the violence is so intimate and so widespread, it's very difficult to trust people. So a process of being able to sort of vet who your potential allies are is an extremely important thing. It's going to be very difficult to reconstruct social confidence in the eventual post-conflict situations. So in the meantime, this vetting of who you may or may not enter into alliances with is very important too.
Otra manifestación de la agencia ciudadana en medio de contextos violentos ha sido el surgimiento de nuevos liderazgos frente a un liderazgo catalogado, pues primero, que no ha sido capaz de responder efectivamente a esas situaciones, pero en segundo lugar, por esa incapacidad se manifiesta en los niveles de corrupción, en los niveles de aceptación mismo de esa violencia, y frente a ello han surgido nuevos liderazgos. Son los liderazgos que vienen, por una parte, de las mujeres que toman la voz, que se arriesgan a pronunciar las denuncias, que se arriesgan a hacer acciones de construcción de memoria, pero por otra parte, igualmente un liderazgo de la juventud, una juventud que genera una actitud autocrítica de revisar que la problemática no está dada únicamente por actores externos que afectan a la comunidad, sino que la comunidad misma ha generado conductas y patrones de comportamiento que justifican o legitiman esas situaciones. Por lo tanto, a partir de esa autocrítica se han generado unas nuevas formas de expresión de ese liderazgo, y que algunos lo han denominado como un liderazgo bueno y que debe tener algunas características fundamentales, entre ellas el que sea unas personas que partan de la escucha permanente a la comunidad, que sean personas que partan de unas creencias compartidas en cuanto a las utopías o en cuanto a las expectativas de construcción de esas alternativas de las que hablábamos hace un momento, frente a un mal liderazgo que justamente no comparte la información, que controla esa información para poder estar haciendo acciones subrepticias con los poderes dominantes. Entonces, ese concepto de nuevos liderazgos manifestados de múltiples formas, simplemente que aquí resaltamos esas dos expresiones de mujeres y jóvenes, pero que cobra la razón de ser de la acción ciudadana frente a esas acciones violentas y al poder mismo que encubre esa violencia misma.
Also, there's been a development of new leaderships in opposition, conscious opposition to traditional leadership, which has been incapable of responding to the challenges and to the situations, but has also been marked by, characterised by corruption and by an acceptance of violence. And so there's been a growth of new leaderships, especially of women who are prepared to assume the risk that is associated with situations that occur and with the construction of or the preservation of the memory of society, and also of youth, which are increasingly self-critical, sort of leaving beside the blame game of just blaming external actors, but also recognising that they themselves have been participants in cultural norms which internalise violence and internalise violent practices, the broad definition of violence. And this has led to a definition, a fairly generally accepted definition of good leadership as opposed to bad leadership. So good leadership involves active listening, activities that are based on shared beliefs, with a utopian vision, a goal, a social goal that leadership action would lead towards. And this is contrasted with bad leadership, where leaders don't share their information, where they control information so that they can then go and sort of operate, negotiate below the table surreptitiously with the corrupt authorities. So as I say, we've got women and young people working with these new forms of leadership in a conscious attempt to overcome the culture of violence.
La segunda pregunta del trabajo de investigación estribó sobre cómo la acción de la comunidad o de la ciudadanía legitima o le confiere autoridad a los actores violentos, o cómo deslegitiman esas acciones, o sea, desconfirman la acción de la violencia. Diferentes formas manifiestan eso. Uno de los ejemplos en los que resaltamos cómo legitiman la acción del poder, cómo legitiman ese poder violento, es las diferentes formas de participación en la política electoral, generando una legitimación o legitimando esa conciencia de no haber estrictamente ciudadanía, sino existir clientes que compran, que venden su voto para poder obtener un beneficio inmediato. Esa práctica está muy inserta en esta dinámica y el poder utiliza esa forma del ejercicio de la política. Entonces, la participación en esa forma clientelista de la política electoral legitima esa violencia. Pero por otra parte, también encontramos acciones que deslegitiman la acción violenta, y son múltiples maneras, y resaltamos uno de los ejemplos que encontramos allí en Buenaventura, es el denominado espacio humanitario, que consiste en personas, en comunidades concretas, en lugares específicos en la ciudad, que se declaran en absoluto rechazo a las acciones violentas y que no permiten la entrada en esos barrios o en esos lugares de ningún actor violento. Esto, por supuesto, es de alto riesgo, porque es declarar abiertamente la resistencia a la violencia, pero es una forma abierta que requiere de muchas alianzas locales, nacionales e internacionales para este nivel de protección. Entonces, la acción colectiva de autoprotegerse, pero negando la acción del otro, es decir, la presencia de la acción violenta, es una de las formas directas de no legitimación de ese poder.
Then the second research question was about the way that citizens act in ways that confer legitimacy on actors and behaviours or that withhold it. So the process of confirming or disconfirming violent norms and actors. And looking at ways in which there are different forms in which violent actions may be legitimised, and we obviously here just want to highlight one of the ways in which it's legitimised, and that's through the process of participation in clientelistic politics, where people, rather than being seen as citizens or seeing themselves as citizens, are seen as clients, and so in return for money they will offer their vote. They get a short-term benefit, but what it actually does is consolidate or ensure the continuation of political power of the same politicians as always the ones who are associated with the violent culture. So that's the way in which people's actions legitimate violent forms. There are many ways, several ways in which people delegitimate or disconfirm the violent practices, and we want to highlight one particular example here, which is the creation of what are called humanitarian spaces, where people in concrete places, a house, a street, declare their rejection of violence and prohibit the entrance or the actions of any violent actors in the area as a conscious declaration of rejection of violence. Now obviously this leads to very high risks. If you have a society that is dominated by armed groups and your response is not to allow them in, then that's a risky thing. Necessary in order for these kind of actions to be successful, to build alliances with local actors, alliances with national actors, but also with international actors. And that's been what's been possible to do in Buenaventura. And this is a very powerful message of rejection of violence through the construction of an alternative built on multi-level alliances.
Thank you. I take over at this point to talk to the last couple of research questions. We were looking and listening to people about what are the factors which hinder their efforts to engage through some form of resistance, through some form of construction of alternatives, and what are the factors that facilitate these. One of the very obvious factors which hinders people's active engagement or people's expressions of resistance or of rejection of violence is, of course, the fear factor, which Chucho has already talked about. And I think that's the emblem of that in the case of Buenaventura is the degree of horror represented by these chopping houses, which are literally located, cheek by jowl with the houses of residents and community leaders, including within the humanitarian space that Chucho talked about. One had recently been dismantled in that street when the humanitarian space was set up. So that degree of horror and terror of knowing that human beings are being taken alive into these houses, chopped up, dismembered, and their body parts thrown into the sea, obviously causes an incredibly high degree of fear about taking action or engaging actively as a citizen, or showing disrespect or disconfirming in any way of those extremely violent actors. So on the one hand, fear in some cases paralyzes, in other cases it protects, because it provides just the degree of kind of self-care that people need to be continually conscious of in order to move in a really, really strategic and careful way in this incredibly dangerous environment. So I think people's response to fear is a very kind of evidence-based response. It's a very direct, raw reading of the situation the whole time, which enables people to calibrate their actions in a way which will keep them alive, even while taking risks in the interests of rejecting violence or expressing resistance to violence. Occasionally, the levels of violence, the types of violence get sensationalized or exaggerated, often through sort of gossip about violence. But I think that sensationalizing itself is a product of traumatic experience, a traumatic context. But in general, most of the worst stories that you hear are true, and people are very aware of this and very, very able to read those situations and calibrate their actions accordingly. A second factor which hinders citizen agency in these settings is the kind of normalization of violence and of conflict which goes on, an internalization of that as normal. And we're talking here about a society where we're now on the third or even the fourth generation of people who've been brought up against a backdrop of civil conflict at the big scale and at the micro scale. So forms of vocabulary, ways of talking to each other, ways of treating each other in the school playground, on the football field, in the street, that have really taken in and absorbed that level of normal everyday violence. Violence doesn't seem remarkable, so getting a distance from it in order to take an action against it or about it has to be a very conscious process, because it's so much part of the backdrop. A third factor which hinders citizen agency is the high degree of ambiguity and confusion about who's who and what's what and who's doing what. And if anything, I found, having watched the process in Colombia over many years, on these last visits last year to Buenaventura, the supposed process of demobilization of paramilitaries, which happened from 2006 onwards, and which has been very, very largely a facade in the area of Buenaventura and in lots of other areas of the country, really caused a sense that there was a higher degree of fluidity, a higher degree of ambiguity. At least before, you kind of knew who was who. You knew the names of the groups, you could tell differences between the uniforms of the paramilitaries and the guerrilla and the state forces, and the kind of civilianization of paramilitarism has increased the degree of fluidity, ambiguity, the difficulty in knowing who you're speaking to and who's doing what. In the case of each tiny neighborhood of Buenaventura, there was a constant fluid process of one band taking over this street or that block or this section of that road or that area of that football pitch. It was that micro level, and I think it still is. So, and the names now don't really have the same kind of political significance as the paramilitary groupings' names had when they were still kind of semi-official shadow paramilitary groups. So that degree of ambiguity and confusion is a hindrance, because you have to be extra savvy, you have to be extra informed to take any action at all, having already weighed up the risks. It's much harder to weigh up the risks in that setting. A further hindering factor is the factor of co-optation, which Tutor mentioned, which can be very deliberate and overt, the buying off of community leaders by logging companies, or by, in the case of Buenaventura, the port system, the modernization of the port, which involved a huge change in the economic context, the social context, and which came with a lot of violence. So kind of systematic buying off of leaders who could be troublemakers if not bought off, and the undermining of social processes, often done through dirty means like gossip against people, or tactics to slur the names of social leaders. Factors which facilitate, well, the aspect that I think is most important here, and which kind of seems to have come to Colombians almost as naturally as breathing, is the factor of conflict analysis. Incredibly detailed, incredibly continuous, even, seeming, certainly when I lived and worked in Colombia, it seemed ad nauseam to me that everybody was always engaging in detailed, on-the-ball conflict and context analysis. But I realised that it's an extremely important aspect of being able to not just survive, but operate and act and exercise agency in a context like this. The continuous gathering and processing collectively, which I think is an important characteristic of it, of very abundant information, as much information as possible, weighing up the quality of the information. Where did this come from? Who told you that? How can we know that we should believe that? Calculations of risks and benefits based on that collective analysis process. A kind of real-time monitoring, which almost happens in the form of neighbourly chatting with your neighbours. And this goes through to, from the level of the international NGO where I used to work in Colombia, but down to the level of every block and every street in Buenaventura. The fact that everybody is constantly all eyes and ears and sharing the information in a way which helps to inform one how to act, what's safe, what's not safe. A further facilitating factor, which has been the focus of a lot of effort in Colombia in the last 10 years, has been the gaining of recognition as subjects and as victims of a strategy of violence. So the victims movement in Colombia has even been heard of, we don't get much news about Colombia, but it's even been heard of in the British media. A process of constructing themselves as victims of violence, which gives them a sense of right. It gives formal rights to people who have been displaced or dispossessed by the violence, or who have suffered massive abuse of human rights. And it gains them new allies in claiming the right, in claiming the moral high ground, in claiming material grounds for compensation of some kind, or for being given some kind of measure of security in this supposed shift towards a post-conflict context. So that's something which facilitates both at the symbolic level, but also in the sense of perception of oneself, classifying oneself as a victim, joining a victims movement, becoming part of a collectivity which is stating this collective right as victims. And finally, a facilitating factor is the importance of small gains in a context like this. And very often small gains gained by some or other initiative of citizen agency are not so much steps forward as stopping things from sliding back even worse, but it still feels like a gain in those circumstances. And the way that such gains provide impetus for bigger efforts is quite remarkable. In particular, the march which Chucho talked about, which took place in a context of such violence and such sort of terrorific violence, horrific violence, was a real kind of sign of how small steps in terms of networking, building alliances, forming leaderships that were prepared to take a role in this situation and make themselves visible in this situation, kind of diluted people's fear, enabled people to take that much bigger step, which was extremely public and which was, it could have turned out not to be well attended. If it had turned out not to be well attended, then the degree of danger in participating was extreme. So the importance of those small steps, which sometimes consist of stopping backsliding or stopping things from getting even worse, to provide impulse for bigger steps forward like that one, which then have their repercussions as well in terms of creating a stronger sense of agency and purpose among people in these very frightening circumstances. To say a word about the final research question, which referred to international actors and how they can best interact with these kind of citizen expressions of agency in contexts such as the Colombian context that we researched in Buenaventura, and the question of whether they should. Some of our colleagues have talked a lot about how in other contexts it would have been better not to intervene. Our colleague who worked on Egypt talked about the mess that had been made in some ways through external intervention. And I think what we see in the case of Colombia is a very particular model. On the one hand, we have some incoherent forms of intervention by foreign actors. So you have, for example, the British government, which one way or another provides support at the micro level to the human rights accompaniers of Peace Brigades International to accompany some of the most threatened human rights defenders in their daily work at the community level. On the other hand, you have the British government supporting the Colombian military in various ways, or working hand in glove with British Petroleum, which has been known to use paramilitaries to protect its installations in some of the most violent-ridden parts of Colombia. So great incoherence between what foreign powers or foreign actors might do at the micro level versus what they do at the macro level, particularly in the case of governments which have a big interest in the extraction of resources from a country like Colombia, which is relatively resource-rich. But it is a desirable situation in the case of Colombia that external intervention should happen, because some models have been kind of tried and tested and near perfected there of using international frameworks at the inter-American level or at the United Nations level, the very global level, to try to address the situation in material ways and in much more symbolic ways, and to reduce the degree of incoherence that happens through really applying in an integral way rights frameworks from the very micro level to the very macro, and trying to ensure that state actors at all of those levels perform their functions in terms of guaranteeing rights, including through the regulation of private sector actors, which are often some of the key perpetrators of violations of rights and of violence, and really do try to set up and honour independent mechanisms of monitoring of these settings. The United Nations Human Rights Commission has a long history of monitoring in Colombia, which is not always respected at all, and has almost come into disrepute as an agency in Colombia because the Colombian government has proved so immune to its recommendations. But given the absence of any other effective structure, it remains a very, very important structure at that sort of supranational level. And at the micro level, our research suggests to us it's important that there be far more initiatives of monitoring and oversight of some of the human rights mechanisms that do exist that are based on citizen perspectives, because the reading of the situation at that level provides insights which, in our experience, are not really visible from other levels of the situation. Obviously, there are kind of disincentives to go and look at the level of the street in cases like Buenaventura. And we had to take care in what we were doing, make sure we were associated with the right people as we did this research. So there are difficulties and disincentives to doing that kind of citizen-level monitoring, but definitely great value to be gained in terms of really getting an understanding of the dynamics of violence and counter-violence at those levels. So that's it on Colombia. Thank you for your patience in a rather longer presentation than the others. I'm very conscious that we've talked a lot at you so far. we have an opportunity now for a short tea and coffee break, 15 minutes. There's tea and coffee at the back of the room. Please do talk to each other and talk to us during the break. And we'll resume at about 25 to 12, so we'll give the full 15 minutes of tea break for the address by Professor Oliver Richmond. I think the ladies and gents are outside, is that right, Erika? We didn't... Oh, sorry, just here at the back of the room. So please make use of the facilities and do have tea and coffee, and we'll see you again in 15 minutes. have 5 minutes. Okay, I'll give you a 5-minute card.
Of course, yes.
Moving this,
no, not at all.
So I'm delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Professor Oliver Richmond. We were squabbling about who was going to get to introduce him, and he said that he was very happy to introduce himself, so we'll do that. He's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and after that we should have ample time for some discussion, questions, comments and things before we break for lunch. So over to you, Oliver.
Is this on? Is that on? Can you hear me? Good. It's really nice to be here, and so far I've been humbled by the richness of the data, documents and the talks. I think many of you are doing the things that I would love to have done, but I was trained as a political scientist, international relations scholar, and of course we're not allowed to have those kinds of capacities, methods and tools to do that kind of work, because we're supposed to maintain and perpetuate some of the power structures which your work finds so problematic. And indeed, that was the topic of my most recent book, which was called Failed State Building, Intervention and the Dynamics of Peace Formation. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the tensions between the project of state building, the state formation literature, which informs state building as a policy practice, and the dynamics of peace formation. Now, peace formation is my sort of idea or understanding of the sorts of patterns and dynamics that you're observing and dealing with in your more ethnographically oriented work on development, peace, security and violence in this range of 5 different cases. But don't let me put words into your mouths. I'm just developing this as a conceptual framework, and I'll try to explain why I use this terminology. I actually have another book which is coming out soon, which is on peace formation, which is called something like Peace Formation and Political Order in Conflict-Affected Societies. And you start to get the idea that what I'm thinking about and what I'm looking at is how the sort of dynamics your work describes signal the formation of institutions, law, practices, the state, and the international. And I think that's a kind of fairly radical view of a bottom-up reconstruction of how we think about policy for peace building, development, state building, and so on and so forth. And we've been pushing at this idea for as long as I've been involved in international relations and peace and conflict studies research, which is over 2 decades. And I do find that although we are often in policy settings, or we're often in settings where we're conducting our research, where we find a lot of affinity or acceptance of these arguments, in practice it's been very difficult to bring them to the policy table or to put them into practice for many scholars in political science and international relations. So there are a lot of blockages to thinking about how peace is formed internally in a direct response to the systems, structures and roots of conflict, both in the international architecture, at the state level, and of course in the power systems that sustain conflict. So that's what I want to talk about a bit today, with some reference to your work here in particular. I do have a kind of PowerPoint overhead which I'll put on at some point, which may or may not be useful. It will perhaps guide us through some of my argumentation, but it's rather long and convoluted. There's a lot of text, and everything I've done in the PowerPoint, I'm told, is not what you should do for PowerPoint. So please feel free to ignore it when I put it up. So my thinking is that when we first started to think about intervention for peace and development, to build the state, the rule of law, institutions, to shape the character of the state, to create a state of a certain type, which had certain state-society relations, a social contract, liberal values, and all those sorts of things embedded into it. There was a kind of post-colonial view of the world amongst the policymakers, in the sense that they wanted to move away from the colonial system, which had been discredited and delegitimated, even though many of them saw liberal imperialism, for example, as a developmental framework And in moving away from that, they began to see the world of development and the world of conflict-affected societies out there as tabula rasas, as more or less empty spaces in which there was no agency, there were no political structures, there were no forms of legitimate authority that would be acceptable in the contemporary world order. The contemporary world order, which was putatively, in the mid-20th century at least, going to be a liberal international world order, a globalized economy, regional organizations, an ever-growing, more and more dense network of systems of intervention to bring about peace and development. That was the kind of modern, bureaucratic, rationalistic, econometric mindset of peace building, development, state building, much of conflict management and conflict resolution theory, as it emerges in the scholarly work, which was coming mainly from Scandinavia, the US, and the UK, and from key policy institutions too. And that very top-down, very rationalistic building block view of creating peace and order, combating violence, locking in institutional peace, as it was extended into the world of conflict and development affected societies, had a range of post-colonial encounters with the subjects of those practices, policies, interventionary processes. And those encounters have not resulted in the straightforward, compliant adoption of policy practices, goals, agendas, the institutional architecture of peace building, state building, and development, but instead have led to its reform, restructuring, reshaping, expansion in some cases, contraction in others. In other words, that encounter with the subject who wasn't there, the peace formation subject, has changed the international architecture. And I think much of the work that, as I read your papers, much of the work I see is a kind of putative discussion of how these bottom-up signalling processes, youth, activism, and so on, ways of evading, avoiding violence, ways of shaping institutions, ways of providing security in very contextual locations, is also offering the possibility of extending bottom-up into the state, which means reshaping the state, and furthermore extending into the international, which means having some input into the systems, structures and architectures of the international community, which itself is then fed back into conflict-affected societies. So that's all well and good. However, of course, the story, as we see from your case studies, has not been that simple, and probably won't ever be that simple. The first thing that I will observe is there are a number of blockages in this bottom-up, grassroots, peace formation process. Some of them relate to the nature of the state, which is locked into a specific understanding of economy, law, territoriality, boundaries, and hierarchy. Today we call this the neoliberal state. I would say that the neoliberal state, as a model and objective for peace building or state building, is a priori a failed design, because it doesn't provide the kinds of resources, institutions or structures or mediating processes which one would need in a conflict-affected society. The night watchman state is not suited to that kind of situation. So if we are to think about those blockages to peace formation, and many of them came up in your papers, I think we also have to think about the types of power that we see extant in international relations, from the local context to the global. And the types of power relate to types of legitimacy, and in particular, from our perspective, the construction of legitimate political authority. It's an old-fashioned term which isn't heard much these days, but it's very important because it ties social consensus across the broad, across the main, with the character of the state. Now, what we've seen in the last 25 years is the state is being characterized by a dominant consensus from within the international community. The model of state that is projected through most of these policies that come from external agency tends to be set in a certain mold, liberal norms, neoliberal frameworks for politics and economy. Which means that the state is legitimated at the international level. It's legitimated externally, which means that the state can be subject to a whole range of internal power structures, practices, processes and norms, which may not be legitimate internationally, but because it's domestic and it harks back to the old black box view of the state and of sovereignty, continue. I would say, if we could break this down very quickly, there are 4 types of power at play here in thinking about the relationship between top-down forms of intervention and bottom-up forms of peace formation. The first is the obvious direct form of power, which is material, military, and it has the ability to make people act in ways which they wouldn't otherwise choose to. The second is structural, which has similar abilities, but it's much more related to the materiality of the geopolitical framework in which the polity or the state or the citizen finds themselves. The third is governmental, and this is related, I would say, to the policy frameworks of both the state and the international, how they shape human and social behaviour within the state. And this is more manipulable. Government practices, governance at the international level can shape how society develops, operates, how the state evolves and grows. The fourth one, and I think that's the one which is the most significant for your project, is what I would call subaltern agency. I kind of shy away from using the word power for this type of agency. But this is the type of agency that we see in everyday contexts, where people make provision for their own security, for their own public services, for the well-being of their families, for the kinds of resources that they may need to survive and develop. And this sort of agency is also a kind of networked agency. It doesn't, I think contrary to many myths about this type of agency, it doesn't exist by itself. But it has to be disguised and camouflaged and hidden. It does not want to be targeted by those other forms of power, the direct, the governmental, and the structural. And to cut a very long story short, if we look at how these types of power entwined and interact in the modern world of intervention, peace building, development, and citizenship, in the specific type of state we have, we can see a kind of hybrid emerging, a hybrid form of polity. It's not quite liberal, it's not quite neoliberal, it's certainly not driven by the subaltern, and the elites don't get their own way. Hierarchical power structures, which may have been causal factors in the root of conflicts in certain societies, are under attack. They're under pressure, inside and outside. So nobody's quite getting their own way. The state that's being formed doesn't quite look like what the internationals would like or expect, what their tools aim at. It's certainly not the kind of co-opted state either that maybe entrenched political elites nationally want, but also it doesn't necessarily represent the kind of emancipatory frameworks that the subaltern, critical agents may be expecting in their engagement with their environments and also with the state. Now, in peace and conflict studies, what we've drawn out of this is that peace as a concept has evolved from a very negative form of peace, in which a great deal of structural violence exists, to a more positive form of peace, in which the international architecture and the state itself are supposed to be locked in to protect those liberal norms of citizenship, human rights, under a democratic system, with a strong rule of law, kind of Rousseauian social contract, and so on and so forth. And the next stage of this argument is to say that in this encounter, in the politics that emerge between all these different forms of power and these different actors, we have a kind of hybrid form of peace emerging, in which all of these systems, structures, forms of power, agency, create, shape, reshape institutions, law, the state, and the international to greater or lesser degrees. So I think that's a very positive reading of this local, subaltern, critical agency. I think it's very important. The problem is that as an international relations scholar, we can't research it. We don't have the methodological tools to do it. It's very difficult, at least for us. Many young PhD students are trying to do this now, but for us, older scholars, we were trained in classical political theorists, most of them who have been dead perhaps 1,000 years, but definitely 100 years. They don't really tell us much about how to research the contemporary world. Just a comment, though, on the methodology. It's become quite obvious that although methodology is thought of in international relations and peace and conflict studies as apolitical, non-ideological, and not really challenging world order, if you think about the methodology that you're using across these different cases, with a kind of flat methodological form of partnership between the institute, the donors who are supporting the research in the different cases, and a whole team of local and international researchers, but we can't identify who's international or who's local in this case. What we're doing is kind of eradicating the power structures, the power relations that have formally constructed knowledge about conflict-affected or development societies. Now, that flat methodological partnership, which we see in your research here, I think is very important. But it's something that international relations, political theory, peace and conflict studies is actually quite resistant to. There's kind of vanguardist aspect to those disciplines. They like to lead. They like to have expert knowledge. So, for example, in the discussion of hybrid peace, which we've had recently, in the discussion of the importance of local agency, resistance, context, all of these things which we've been borrowing from anthropology and from sociology and ethnography and so on, in more mainstream positivist theory and policy, a new term has been substituted for the local. I noticed a term that you're using actually in your project, and that's the micro. Now, the micro has a lot of methodological baggage as a term, as does the macro. I think it's something which we need to think about. The local does too, as does context. But I think the local context allow a kind of normative discussion. Now, of course, the register of the micro and the macro exclude normative discussions, exclude ethical discussions in at least mainstream political science and international relations. Now, this is an example of a hybrid methodological framework and statement. And there are implications here which I think we need to discuss in the context of peace formation. So let me get to that if I may. So this one goes like that. Okay, in international relations and peace and conflict studies, what we've tended to have is a reading of a reading of peace as something very straightforward. It's strategic and geopolitical. It happens at the high level. Groups of elite, elder men and generals around a large conference table hammering out a peace agreement, hopefully with some powerful guarantees from outside. It recreates the state and the geopolitical order of the state. That form of peace, let's call it a negative peace, does not really comment on the nature of state, the nature of society, rights, ethics, norms, values, culture, and all of those things that might come with a more positive form of peace. Now, clearly, there's a lot of gaps in that kind of argumentation, that kind of logic. So that way of thinking about peace, let's call it conflict management, only really exists in a few now small North American corners. And fairly soon, we got into discussing, by the 1990s at least in the academic literature, discussing comprehensive, multi-level, multi-dimensional forms of peace. And what we discovered pretty quickly was that those forms of peace were very much framed by liberal thinking, which meant that they were Eurocentric, they were drawn from the European understanding of how a state system could balance the rights of citizens with the interests of states and geopolitical order. And this liberal peace, which we see emerging in the 1990s, responds to that question by saying, well, what we need are democracies. Clearly, democracies don't fight. Democracies allow citizens to express themselves in fundamental ways, to claim rights, to have access to markets, and all of those sorts of things. Very quickly, though, the outcome of that debate was the neoliberal state argument. And this is what happened in the 2000s with the state-building argument. So the argument here drifted away from the idea that individuals have rights under the liberal peace, and therefore one must foreground the agency and rights of the individual, although not the materiality of the individual, social, economic, and cultural rights. The neoliberal state-building paradigm went even further away from that, because it was much more geopolitical, much more strategic, and ideologically associated with global capital, and with neoliberal readings of global capital, which then infused peace-building and development strategies, I think, from many of the key donors around the world, based very much on a kind of 19th century view of the small state. It provides a lot of security. It never asks who that security is for. And therefore, the citizenry, if you like, are seen as the resource of the receivers of security. That's the neoliberal state framework. Now that paradigm hasn't lasted very long because it wasn't very successful. And it raises the question of, under those two phases, those two epochs, liberal peace building in the 1990s and neoliberal state building in the 2000s, broadly drawn, what actually were the citizenry doing? Where was peace coming from? And that's what I'd like to address. Firstly, though, just to say that the state building framework, which conditioned our understanding of a lot of intervention in the 2000s, again, very much driven by a particular wing of the northern donor system, if you like, ideological wing, but it was drawing very heavily on a long-standing academic literature on state formation. And the state formation literature had pieced together the historical record of where states come from, really going back the last 500 years or so. And it comes to the conclusion by the 1970s and 1980s that all states effectively came from power struggles. And the raison d'etre of the state is really just to balance elite power struggles over material and geopolitical resources. So the state formation literature, which informed state building in the 2000s, was a very negative literature. You can say at best it was a negative peace literature. And really that type of literature wouldn't have much problem with the types of states that we've seen emerging in the last, let's say in the post-colonial period. The states which are oligarchical, hijacked by predatory elites, in which citizen rights are marginal, in which resources are badly distributed, and so on and so forth. Because the whole point of the neoliberal state and the state building, the historical framework of that state building project, is not to address those issues at all, but simply to try and maintain a state structure which provides minimal levels of security at minimal cost, which means you have to have power sharing between oligarchic elites within the state and across the international. So in some ways, a very feudal understanding of the role of the state. If we go back to the 1990s and think about liberal peace building, because it was based on human rights and democratization, it was much more closely connected to the Enlightenment view of human agency, that people will struggle for rights, attempt to lock those rights, that they will act, they will attempt to lock those rights into institutions and law, and the state itself becomes the symbolic and material framework in which those rights, the rights of the people, the citizens, are locked into the state. So it's understandable, if you look at this photograph here, this is taken from a UN base in Kosovo, it's quite understandable then that these subjects on the ground, who, if you remember at the start of my argument, don't actually really exist, looked at international intervention, spanning the peace-building and state-building eras of the 1990s and the 2000s, and thought it wasn't particularly fair particularly when they were fighting, struggling in a whole range of sophisticated and complex but hidden ways for rights to join the liberal international community, and so on. So you'll see, this is a UN base here. There's a bit of graffiti which suggests that the poor UN workers in this particular area of Kosovo didn't do a very good job in bringing social justice. This is from a group of leftist activists in Kosovo, who've since actually become quite a significant political force in Kosovo. And this was slightly shocking to the UN personnel in Kosovo. I think there were attempts to suppress this type of imagery, if you like, because it seemed to suggest that the peace-building and state-building interventionary practices were seeing a loss of legitimacy from the very subjects whom they were claiming to save and reform. So there's a broad, systemic and structural conclusion to be drawn from this little picture. So the problem seems to be that intervention, broadly defined from the military to peace building, to state building, to development, and now it's this whole technocratic range of programming that we have, the programming of non-Western, non-Northern societies who are conflict affected and developmental, is not connected to local power bases. It's not connected to local culture or custom, nor to local aspirations. Now, that's a bit of a problem, because much of the supposition, the assumptions that were that it was based on, these policy frameworks were based on, was that this was a universal framework for thinking about the position of the citizen in relation to the state and the international, in normative, legal, social, political and economic terms. It applies to everybody on the planet, and the argumentation is that everybody in their right mind would, if they knew and had sufficient knowledge, would accept this framework. And yet what we seem to see in Kosovo, and in many other cases simultaneously by the way, was something of a rejection of this framework. Or maybe not quite a rejection, but a rejection that outside actors had executive power in situations where there were ongoing political struggles, whether liberation struggles or struggles against oppression, and so on and so forth. And it raised the question for internationals that they don't want to ask because they can't answer. Can you export from outside peace and the state? Okay, in my overhead, which I can leave with you and you can have a look at in more detail, there are a number of different examples, cases that I've done, but I won't have time to talk about those. What I'd like to do is talk about the range of international perspectives of the local, briefly. Now, I think some of them at least are captured in these quotations here. Intervention claims legitimacy by virtue of the fact that it's building liberal states in a global economy, in an increasingly regionalised architecture, in an increasingly dense system of informal and formal NGOs, INGOs, social movements, international institutions and organisations, donors, and so on and so forth. This system is at its most dense in history. However, when you go to somebody in the UN Department of Political Affairs and ask them to talk to you about how this particular wing of the UN thinks about local agency and the kinds of signals it's sending through its resistance, its activism, and so on and so forth, here's one response I had. We should not expose ourselves to local contexts. We risk our ignorance undermining our legitimacy. There's a clear connection here between the idea that we don't know the local, therefore it's very difficult to govern. We need legitimacy to govern, so we should know the local. Now this is a classic international perspective which goes back right the way through colonialism. This is a mechanism which has historically always connected international trusteeship government, or colonialism, with native administrations. And I'd be very wary, and I will suggest that there are signs of this in the world today, by the way, re-emerging. So you see Somebody from the Peace Building Commission tells me that the only way you can sort out Haiti is through trusteeship. Revive an explicit trusteeship system, perhaps under the UN trusteeship system. But then you have somebody from UNDP saying to me, actually the problem's not the local. There's a lot of agency, there's a lot of activism, there's vision and aspiration, there's a comprehension of rights in the context of social history and custom. It's the lack of political will. And here's a term we don't hear very often these days, but it was very much in circulation 20 years ago when I was first becoming interested in these sorts of issues. Things that weren't going right with human rights and democratization and development and so on were often blamed on the political will. And whose political will? It was elites. It was the state structures. Quite often it was also the donors. We seem to have forgotten about that. And then the counter-narrative, which also keeps coming up when you talk about this type of agency that you're interested in, is to point to terrorist or insurgent organisations and say, well, this is local agency. Is that what you want? To shape the state? To run politics? And so on and so forth. Now, very problematic position, of course, because there's no point making peace or having development without society in its entirety being involved. You have to make peace between enemies. No point trying to make peace only between like-minded pals or friends. So, this brings me to conclude, to peace formation. And this is where I think it connects with your work. The policy and theoretical frameworks that we have, peace building, and state formation, these are the key frameworks from which we get modernization theory and development, and all of these sorts of intellectual frameworks for intervention are based on a negative view of human social agency, if it's outside the global north, effectively. And even the global north is rather negative too. We do not want to see that agency politicized. So therefore the state and the architecture and the policy instruments have to be externally designed according to expert knowledge. And expert knowledge is external and it's governmental. It's not direct and structural. It's external and governmental. Expert knowledge is never subaltern. It's never critical agency from the subaltern. Now, that's a set of assumptions which run through, I think, the whole development of political theory, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and so on and so forth. Although all of them always say that local agency, civil society, what I'm trying to call peace formation, are also crucial. So, what we need is a conceptual and policy framework which foregrounds the kind of agencies, processes, systems, structures, practices, cleverness, skills that your work here has laid open, although I hope it hasn't laid it open to the degree that it can become exploited. And I think we have to move away from these terms, actually peace building, state building, and so on, because they do carry with them this whole legacy of historical forms of intervention. They allow us to say that peace and the state and development rest on specific types of knowledge which are only available in certain quarters, in certain areas of the world. And yet, if we go to the anthropological record, what we see is in actual fact, most peace building and state building, and even development, doesn't have a great deal of impact in context. And how people live in those situations, and in my case, I look at Kosovo, Timor-Leste, Cyprus and Bosnia in this particular overhead, what you see is a lot of innovative critical social agency. So I'll call this peace formation. This is peace which has been formed from within society. In the social spaces which confront violence, power structures, which know history and context, whether it's geopolitical, social, cultural, or religious. This is where the experts are, the conflict experts. However, and this is a bit like reading tea leaves, these are only signals, because historically, that kind of agency has been blocked. It's very easy to block it. It has no material resource, it's far away from everywhere, including its own capitals quite often. It has to disguise itself. It networks across society and indeed regionally or internationally these days, as we can see in this room. But it also has to be very cautious about its public face pronouncements and writings. So it's automatically self-censoring, because if it didn't, it wouldn't exist. Because structural, economic and political power, which we see in the modern state, the global economy, and in the international institutions, is actually aligned against it. So peace formation provides signals, and the types of agency and practices that we see in your papers here, and in some of the work that other people are doing too, are an attempt to open up those signals a little bit, and to show how policy is disconnected from those signals, international policy and practice is disconnected from those signals, and indeed how the modern state, which has been built in many conflict-affected societies, is also disconnected from those signals. You know, we've seen examples of states being built in the last 20 years which were not able to provide public health facilities for its own citizens. What type of state is that? You know, I'm thinking here about West Africa and with the recent events there. So these are states which have failed by design. The international is not able to read the peace formation signals. So what I would like to hear more about then is how these signals might be translated into actionable policy, institutional and state reform, and how the power relations, the power structures which have historically been preventing that, or at least retarding it, because it has been happening, but slowly, might be removed or shamed, or turned on themselves, and turned into something which is much more productive. Now, I think there's a lot of political culture which is against that. As you saw from my quotations earlier about the local and its place in policy, we're pushing against a rather closed door, not fully closed, but rather closed door. Because the attitude is still that trusteeship is probably the best compromise. And trusteeship needs compliant local elites. And therefore, we form alliances which we call power sharing, because power sharing brings about at least a negative peace. Because all of that local stuff and that local agency, the nature of the state it would form, the type of law it would want, and the type of economy it would want, may not actually fit in with the broader paradigm at the international level of this liberal international architecture in a global capitalist system. And it's that dichotomy, that conflict, that tension between context and the increasingly democratically expressed voice of citizenship and the state which was created in the 19th century as a concept, this particular state, and the international which was created in the 20th century as a concept, which seems to be out of sync. So my final question for you would be, you have subaltern, governmental, structural and direct power running through all of these relations, which are unequal relations. Is your work saying that the subaltern should signal an alignment from those other levels, from the state and from the international? Should the state and the international represent the claims that are being made by your subjects in your research? Is that what we're after? Or are we thinking about building or accepting a system in which there are these different levels are working against each other, in which there are differences and tensions between these levels? Is that tension indeed productive? Is it the tension that creates the momentum for development, for peace building, for statehood, for peace processes and agreements themselves to come into being? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I think any of us who thought that we would get the answers have been given some more meaty questions to get stuck into. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to suggest that we eat into our lunch break just a wee bit in order to have time for a proper questions, answers, comments, discussion session. I said I would chair this bit just to help by lining up questions that I guess maybe the best way is if we take a handful of questions or points or comments at a time and give Oliver the chance to respond in bunches or batches. I was certainly left with loads of questions. I would need to think hard about how to formulate any of them. Anybody with burning issues, questions that wants to kick off this? Sorry, I forgot to say, when you ask a question, would you like to just introduce yourself and say where you're coming from?
Hi, my name is Partha. I'm a master's student at Cambridge University. I suppose, I was wondering, is there a risk in looking at this framework and looking at these case studies through the sort of framework of looking at critical subaltern agency and finding what we want to see in it, to see kind of this progressive, transformative vision that's often a peaceful one and a kind of deliberative one. When I research Uganda, and there are a lot of critical, we might well call them subaltern agents, often their visions of change are aligned with, say, calling for international intervention, military international intervention to bring about regime change, or to, say, take on the forms of political violence akin to a liberation struggle. And it seems, can we encourage that as well if that is kind of the subaltern agency? It's kind of, we then start reading our own ideology and values, and is there a risk that then we kind of, although we're trying to bring the local out in the things that we prioritise and look for, we inevitably remain complicit in our own understandings of the world?
Thanks, great one to kick off with. Okay, would you like to respond to that one, Oliver, while people are thinking?
No, there's one here.
Oh, sorry.
Picking up from your last point about the tension between international global norms and local power structures, I think one of the areas where that tension is most apparent is in relation to gender policy. And I'm wondering whether you had any particular insights into that area. And the question that you pose about could that tension actually be constructive, or does it need to be resolved, is a very pertinent one in relation to gender policy. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, and whether you have any specific thoughts in relation to the evidence that's coming out of this research project.
Can I just invite you to say who you are?
Oh, sorry. Judy Bushra.
Okay, let's go ahead with those two, what other people think.
Partha, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, at least in the terms of peace movements, that the agency is marginal. I think in the case that I've looked at, what we tend to see are the creation of little peace ghettos in a way. For example, in the Cyprus case, good politics is to be a nationalist, and so to be interested in peace without nationalism is really very dodgy, because you get excluded from the state, you get excluded from political institutions, you won't get a good job in the public system or promotion. There'll be all kinds of ways in which sanctions will be placed against you. What we've seen over 30 years is the creation of a very tiny peace community in which people have taken the conflict, if you like, into their own hands, and they have, in conceptual, theoretical, cultural, social, political ways, in many ways, they've resolved a lot of the issues of the conflict, but they've done it autonomously in their own groups. Now, their own groups aren't just it's not just about individuals. It's more significant. It is a movement, but it's very small. And the question is, could that be scaled up? But then what would happen to the nationalist majorities who still dream about territorial sovereignty and liberation and independence and all of those sorts of things? I mean, they would have to be converted. And that clearly hasn't happened in the Cyprus case. In other cases where you see these small groups, they are being scaled up. Sometimes they infiltrate the state. But the kind of version of peace that they're offering is more negative than it is positive. So in the Cyprus case, they have literally created themselves a small territorial space. It's called the Home for Cooperation, and it's in the buffer zone between the two armies, where they can meet freely and talk and think intercommunally, as it were. But in the national spaces, you can't do that. In other cases, you see how this kind of thinking is scaled up to the state. It becomes a state, it shapes a state, it influences a state. But as it's scaled up, it's diluted. So you end up with very much a negative form. So, for example, I'm thinking about Kosovo here and the kind of the way in which the parallel institutions and the shadow state and so on and so forth were scaled up. But in the encounter of their kind of socialist liberation movement ideology with neoliberal state building, they ended up with something quite different and actually run by oligarchs in the end. So civil society and peace actors in Kosovo still feel quite marginalised, even from their own peace community who have entered the state. And there are other examples where you've got even more formal scaling up into peace infrastructures and peace ministries and all of these sorts of things. The politics gets murkier the more successful you are in scaling up, it seems. So I don't think we're reading our own interests and values into those peace communities, because these are autonomous, freestanding actors who are exercising agency, who happen to look around the international and think that there are some good things out there which they want to connect with and network with and do it very successfully and very carefully. This is not merely a projection from people like me or others who want to see the best in some people in conflict societies. The alternative to, by the way, not looking for those things and not engaging with them, even if they are quite marginal in the mainstream of conflict-affected societies, is that we don't listen and we establish trusteeships with compliant native administrations who we have to buy off. So it becomes an oligarchical exchange, which is an even more negative form of peace, I think. So I don't think we have much choice but to look and engage with, and at some point some normative judgments do have to be made. Julia, your comment is very good, because in the literature on peace, the negative-positive peace dichotomy is very much drawn from a specific methodological positive understanding, positivist understanding of the world, in which peace and order can be thought about in scientific ways, and perhaps even simulated in kinds of laboratory conditions and built through certain types of states, and so on. But the emancipatory arguments about peace, which have brought out these kind of dynamics of hybridity, of empathy, of the very tricky forms of agency that have to be employed by different actors, whether it's youth or women and so on and so forth, have come from other methodological quarters. So I think we can see this struggle over which voices need to be rebalanced vis-à-vis the other in methodological terms, also in political terms. It is true that often gender is used as a reason why local agency can't be taken seriously in peace building, state building practice, and why international norms are better or best, at least in order to drive those. And on the surface, it certainly looks to be the case. You think about the Taliban and so on. This is the example that's often brought up. But I know from other cases, for example, Timor-Leste, where some local scholars who have worked in the international settings, in international organisations, but also have been through the conflict themselves, wrote their policy briefings in refugee camps, have worked in Western and local universities and all those sorts of things, have been writing about the kind of residual social frameworks which were meant to keep peace and order in those contexts, and how people operated under occupation, under the Indonesian occupation, in the context of the war in 1999 as well, but also in the state-building endeavours that followed that, when they began to rescue the historical archive of social interactions, the gender picture was much less clear. Now, the internationals had arrived in that particular context and said that women really had no place in politics, and and their place in the economy was more or less as drudge. It wasn't as innovator, it wasn't as leader, and all the rest of it. And some of this group's work have been saying that that's not the case in actual fact. And in fact, there were matrilineal societies, matriarchal societies, or communities at least in Timor-Leste. And so there was a balance of wide diversity in gender relations across the country, which the internationals missed. And could have been, if you like, rescued and brought in. I also heard similar conversations about Kosovo, by the way. When the peace processes in Kosovo were underway, there was a commitment by local actors that around the table there would be a good gender balance. And after the NATO intervention, the internationals turned up to that very table and there was no women present. And when asked, well, why are women not part of this peace process? Of course, the response was, well, there have been no women leaders in the parallel institutions in Kosovo's political history. And so we need to nurture this in the future, but right now the conversation has to take place between these people. So there are all kinds of interesting ways in which this balance plays out or doesn't, in the way in which the internationals think that their norms are superior and higher, and the way in which the local recovery of a pre-conflict history also points to practices which are much more subtle and complex, which are signalling, I think. And in the Kosovo case, we also see some signalling under socialism, with the, if you like, the complex relations between the religious identity and socialism as a system of equality for citizens in that case. So I don't think we shouldn't be so simplistic to say that in certain cases the internationals come with better norms and values, although it certainly may well be in some contexts the case.
Thank you. I think we've got time for another round, so let's just collect a few more questions or points now, and then probably once Oliver has fed back on those, we should probably break for lunch. So, Tom, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. I'm looking at the statement you made that the rise of the rule of experts, they are taking over with executive power and executive and an accountable power. Now, we are talking about democracy, in countries in Africa, Kenya being one of them. And in the recent past, we have had democratic elections and we are looking at the rule of law. But what is emerging is that, if we are going to have the rule of experts, then it means that the government, basically a democratic government, which is elected by the people, is alienating the people themselves. And it is being legitimated, by external actors, while it has no legitimacy within the citizens. So the question I'm asking then is, what is the future of democracy? Because if we are legitimizing and we are having external people coming to control the affairs of the country, then what's the future for democracy in Africa? Then, in that same line, I don't know how to frame this one, but we have cases of terrorism that are emerging in Africa, and particularly Kenya, And what is happening, what we are seeing is a democratically elected government, using terrorism to take away some of the hard-fought rights that people have done, criminalizing peaceful protests in the name of fighting terrorism. Such kind of stuff which is undemocratic, but it's gaining justification somewhere else. I don't know what you can also comment about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more comments, questions at this point? I was hoping that maybe someone from our researchers or co-researchers might want to reflect on the juxtaposition that you closed with about are we claiming that the state and the international level should be reflecting faithfully the kinds of points of view that we have reflected in our very micro, very randomly sampled case studies, or whether there's a necessary constructive creative tension between them. But perhaps that's for later in the day, because I think that's a big question that we have all come with. Okay, would you like to respond to? Oh, sorry, Death Row. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think one thing that really struck me from your comments was the ways in which bottom-up forms of agency and transformation are at odds not only with the conflict, but also with the larger development paradigm, and particularly the neoliberal economic project. And in the fieldwork in both Zimbabwe and Colombia, conflicts which are apparently ideological or rooted in political contestation actually have very strong kind of economic interests and underpinnings. So in Buenaventura, as Chucho pointed out, the main driver of this really horrible violence was actually, it's no longer a political, ideological guerrilla war. It's a war for land, resources, control of the port, huge investments coming in from other countries to modernize the port, a port which actually also serves as the main exit point for containerized cocaine from Colombia. We're talking about, you know, millions and billions of investments using violence as a way to displace Afro-Caribbean people from land that they have actually created with landfill, to create islands that are not titled because they are below the high water mark. So there's a land they have created that's part of their own identity, and these are people who've been displaced by the war already from river communities, having their communities shattered in order to gain control of the land. And I just think that that point you made about the links to the economic paradigm are really, really important. In the case of Zimbabwe also, where, you know, the narrative is that it's, you know, ZANU-PF and MBC and so on. The biggest drivers of conflict that we saw were people being pushed off their land being grabbed, the state being complicit in allowing developers to take land that people had settled and farmed on for generations. You know, these economic drivers were really paramount. So I just wondered if we need to pay more attention to the signaling, as you're calling it, for economic alternatives and the kinds of movements that Chucho described that are rooted around solidarity economies and Buen Vivir and other kinds of ways of seeing a sustainable economy, environmental movements and so on, as part of the mix. And that maybe gets lost in the overtly political focus on settlements.
Thank you. The rule of experts question is really interesting, because I don't know whether anyone's seen the book by Tim Mitchell called The Rule of Experts, published in 1991, I think, in which he describes how bureaucratic knowledge from the colonial era in Egypt has created a kind of neutral space of power in which it can bureaucratically control lives and resources in Egypt without raising normative issues, without raising ethical issues connected to forms of government, governance and rights. So the rule of experts, according to Mitchell and a lot of later work, creates a system in which you can do peace building and development and governance, global governance too, without knowing the subject and without really caring about the positionality of the subject. This is where, and this is a kind of Foucauldian move, which people like J.S. Scott also draw on too. This is where governance in the colonial era becomes divorced from the material reality of life in conflict and development settings. And I think we're living at the back end of that now, in a time where government isn't really related to the conditions we face in our lives. What it's related to, actually, is a modernisation vision of how the citizen should be in the future. Now, the problem with that kind of argument is that if you go back to the expert knowledge that was being used about Egypt, or indeed Afghanistan, in the 1880s and the 1890s, they were mainly drawn from travelogues of, elite British Victorian travellers with their entourages who dragged a carriage, through the country, writing down little pastiches of the people they met and the things they saw and the conditions and how different things were from back home. And this type of knowledge, over time, expands and becomes the basis of colonial government. And then, over time, it becomes rejected as the basis for peace building and state building, because by that point we have not just expert knowledge about the place, but we have, at least what the governors think, the politicians and the policymakers think, we have expert knowledge about the systems required for peace and development. So the place is removed. The place no longer exists. It's just about the system, the type of state, the type of policy, the type of instrument, the type of program, and so on and so forth. It's an erasure of the human population of the world, effectively. I mean, to make a kind of radical and extreme statement about it. So the rule of experts allows people to be trained in that epistemological framework without knowing the world, without knowing the place. And this is what Timothy Mitchell is arguing. And he really predicts the next 25 years of development and peace building and state building, which is not at all connected to the really existing experience of people, women and children, youth and adults, in conflict-affected societies around the world, as far as I can see. And you only have to talk to them, as you have all done in your case studies, to realise this. So I think there's something a bit more subversive at play here. It's not that the knowledge doesn't exist from the subaltern. It's that conflict expertise constructed in this way, without context, in the interests of institutions, in the interests of agencies, in the interests of a version of the state, a version of citizenship, is preeminent because it's hegemonic. In knowledge terms, in dissemination, in material terms, and all the rest of it. So when you ask what is the future of democracy, well, I mean, under that system, it's going to be very poor. I mean, democracy is being attacked by that bureaucratic rationality of expert knowledge about peace, order, the state and rights. It's also been undermined by neoliberal understandings of agency, too. Because neoliberal understandings of agency don't say, as I've said, agency in difficult circumstances offers signals. We could learn from those signals and work out how to enable. Neoliberal agency says, great, there are signals. That's it. It's up to them. As long as the security situation is calm for us, the markets are open, there are not issues over there which concern us. It's very communitarian, it's very limited. So the future of democracy is limited under that framework. However, that framework hasn't been very successful, so it may well not survive. And there are a number of peace processes ongoing still under that framework, which haven't got very far. Not being able to negotiate the economic model in Colombia, the failures over Syria with chemical weapons and so on and so forth. Terrorism, though, of course, is the great friend of those sorts of limited understandings of statehood. Neoliberal statehood loves terrorism because it allows it to emphasise the security control aspects and to de-emphasise the public service, the public good aspect, because there simply aren't resources available. So everything goes to security. So the demos suffers under the kind of hyper-liberal state. To go to the second question briefly, I think often bottom-up agency is at odds with both existing power structures, that is the conflict itself in many contexts, although sometimes it's sympathetic to some of the issues that drive conflicts. It's also sometimes at odds with the economic model. A lot of people in conflict affected societies, struggle for socialist independence, for example, and haven't been too happy that what they got was neoliberal dependency. But then there are others within those same communities who are quite keen on neoliberalism. It gives them freedom and freedom of movement and so on and so forth. I think, though, your point, and that is an important point. I think what it suggests is that we can't make decisions about that. We don't have, outsiders don't have the executive right to decide what the economic model should be in a specific context. That comes back down to democracy and self-determination and a level of independence in the world. We are always, as Western scholars working on development and peace building, in a sensitive position when it comes to those sorts of issues, the executive power to decide somebody else's political system, economic system and social system. I think the last 25 years suggests we don't have that executive power, and we shouldn't really be trying to exercise it, only to save lives directly. And then the form of the system itself, really that's up to the types of agencies that we suggest, but that your papers have been exploring. The problem is that those agencies are very marginal. Can we ever see a possibility that those agencies would build the states in Colombia or in Zimbabwe or in Egypt? Is it possible? So probably not, which means that they have to be connected transnationally, transversally, they have to be enabled. So we do need an interventionary apparatus, because that's how rights, that's how development, that's how identity and so on and so forth can be safeguarded as it is defined by its own subjects, its own agents. But that's quite different to telling people how to be, how to identify, and so on and so forth, which we can sum up in the last 25 years under one simple statement, which is, you will become liberal. And if I could go to your comment on land, that's a really important comment. Again, we tend to forget this, but isn't the basis of all politics land? Whether land is common, or shared, or private, or enclosed. Because from land comes resources, and from resources come the multiplication of the human agency that we're discussing. Now, most of the people that you mention in your fieldwork do not have access to land of their own, do not have income, do not have rent, do not have access to material resources from that land. They are not sovereign in territorial terms. So they find other spaces in which to exercise agency, other ways, other zones in which to exercise agency. But land is still the most heavyweight materiality that we have, that the state has in modern history. Although capital and technology are challenging the preeminence of land in today's world of sovereign states. Can I just make one other kind of related comment to both of those, which is related to the question of expert knowledge. How is expert knowledge about conflict societies, as we are searching for in our work, best constructed? Now, it seems to me that in the examples I gave you of the quotes from UNDP and the Peace Building Commission and the UN Department of Political Affairs, that they were defending an a priori international expert knowledge, which is not connected really to context, or if it is connected to context, it's connected to the state formation context of medieval Europe and the post-war world as they understood it, in which the modern state, the global economy came into being. So it's not a here and now expert knowledge. It's lagging behind some 60 or 70 years at least. And you can see in those quotations that they reject the other type of expert knowledge, that is the right of individuals to self-determine their peace, their state, their development for themselves. But there is a possibility, I think, an access point, which is to look at, in a world of mobility of capital and people, as this room indicates, is to look at, in a kind of biographical way, the political aspirations, ideas, understandings and information, empirical information, that we get from the people who straddle those worlds. Now, I'm not sure that I straddle any local contextual worlds. I'm a product of a hyper-mobile, hyper-neoliberal economy in which mobility is everything, and I move for work, and that's what determines my life. So I'm not really able to speak to context other than that kind of context of globalized capital. But there are many people who are now coming into our universities and our institutions, into the architecture itself, who very concretely straddle the local context and those experiences with international institutions, organisations, NGOs, movements, and so on, and so forth. And you can do a kind of ethnographic biography. In a way, this is what your work is suggesting, in order to understand what the claims are they're making against the state, against development, against the international, for peace, security, order, and development. So that knowledge is available. But when you go to, for example, a Foreign Affairs Select Committee on whether there will be a peace agreement on Cyprus in the coming 6 months, they're not there. They're not present in the room. And that's a real structural problem. And behind that lack of presence of those individuals who straddle the conflict and developmental world with the institutions and the global north and so on, is a whole series of structural blockages. Defensive power, ideological positionality, an unwillingness to give up expert knowledge. But it actually isn't expert knowledge. It's positionality and it's privilege, I think.
Well, just in the interests of lunch, I think we should probably call a pause there. I'm very much left thinking, okay, so what on earth do we do with our research? It's as if, as we knew, I think, when we started out on it, to expect our main message to get taken up would be to ask the international peace-building and state-building community to self-destruct and to shoot holes in the vacuousness of its own claims to epistemological hegemony. So that's a big one to go away and have lunch on. Hopefully we can answer that one by 4:30 anyway. Could I invite people to help yourselves to lunch at the back of the room? Before everyone stands up, Jethro's just going to make a very short announcement about what's going to be going on after lunch and something that you might do over lunch.
So I think